Hello, and welcome to the fourth video lecture for the course. I'm Dr. Jonina Anderson Lopez. I'll be grading and facilitating discussion posts. It's possible another instructor is facilitating the course, and if so, please review the the lecture portions of the video, noting that the details about assignments may be different from what you see in the module. Oh, went too fast there. This week we'll be reviewing some concepts about fictional detectives, two concepts to be exact. In the strictest and most general sense, the amateur detective is simply someone who isn't employed as a detective. They don't get paid for figuring out who the murderer is. Speaking more specifically, amateur detectives can be broken down into the two broad subcategories we're going to discuss, the amateur and the amateur professional. The amateur is someone who operates completely outside of professional life. Because of this, the opinion of the amateur is often not taken seriously. In week 3, you saw an example of an amateur in the figure of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple in the trailer for Murder, she said. Miss Marple, pictured on the screen in a TV show from 2004 through 2013 that adapted Christie's work. She's an old spinster who never married, and though she generally seems to be financially comfortable, she has never needed to hold a steady job. She is, as they say, of independent means, and she consequently has no career to speak of. In other words, Miss Marple is an amateur detective and an amateur of really any profession. Her most notable trait is that she seems to be something of a busybody, and she's well aware of what's going on in everyone's lives. But for this reason, and because of her mental prowess, she's uniquely suited to figure out who committed the murder. Being a busybody in her case is like a really good thing. As you might guess, amateurs can sometimes be very empowering figures for some, which might account for their popularity. They validate the mental abilities of people who the rest of us might ignore. Historically speaking, in some ways, the amateur detective has been an empowering figure because they're usually someone whose views and abilities haven't been taken seriously. We've seen this clearly through Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, and often in the amateur story, a big part of the plot revolves around other characters learning to take this amateur seriously. And so these stories can um, serve as a model for how we can learn to respect the opinions of abilities of people we wish to or have been ignoring. We will take a look at the amateur detective through the example of Mr. and Mrs. North. They're illustrated on the right in the first edition cover of the first novel. They were popular through novels, plays, radio broadcasts, and television from the 1930s to the 1950s. Often, Mr. North's profession is not specified, but more to the point, it's generally Mrs. North who solves the case. She's an amateur detective, and given expectations for married women in the time, she's no career of her own. Those around her, often including her doting and loving husband, treat her in a flippant manner. She's rarely taken seriously, but she uses this to her advantage. She's a classic example of an amateur detective. So, I mean, it's never good to generalize, right? Exceptions exist to every rule. Yet, the match between the amateur detective hero and the classic whodunit detective story is a very strong one. That's not to say that whodunit fiction is limited to amateur detectives. Whodunit crime fiction was extremely popular in the middle 19th century. Its formula was simple. There's a crime that needs to be solved. There's a very limited amount of suspects, the possibility of creating the crime. The locale of the crime is usually very limited, like a house, a theater, or some other self-contained edifice. There is a detective, most often a non-professional, an amateur, and voila, the crime is solved. On the screen are examples of modern and diverse portrayals of amateur detectives. There's only 10 listed here, but I'm sure you've heard of some that are not on this list that I have curated. While the terminology amateur and amateur professional detectives may be a bit of a mouthful, the distinction drawn between the two is important to consider. Amateur detectives, as we have seen, they're often amateurs in at least two senses. First, they're not professionally trained to do the detective work. Second, they have no professional career of their own, a fact that often leads others to dismiss them as insignificant. For the murderer, this is often their undoing. Amateur professional detectives are amateurs in the sense that they are not professionally trained detectives. On the other hand, they are usually highly trained professionals who are highly regarded in some type of profession. So they might be doctors, lawyers, news reporters, priests, writers, etc. A modern example I can think of might be like the TV show Bones, right? She wasn't a detective per se, but they were always solving something. She was a professional. So typically, they've been in the amateur professional have been in their chosen career for a long time. The nature of their work has honed their mental faculties in a way that has naturally prepared them for identifying murderers. Another distinction might become clear between amateur professionals and amateur amateurs. If you look at the examples of amateur professional detectives in the module contrasted against others, most of the examples of amateur professional detectives I can think of are men, whereas many of the examples of amateur detectives are women. What do you think might account for this difference? It's not something you have to answer. It's just something that you can consider. Maybe it will help you while you're drafting one of your form responses, or it's just something to think about. On the screen are examples of modern and diverse portrayals of amateur professional detectives. Again, I'm sure you've heard of some that are not on this list, or you haven't heard of any of these, and maybe it might inspire you to look up a few. So altogether for week 4, the modules will review more about Agatha Christie, some stuff about Father Brown, and then there's also other links, stories, and videos to review. Reviewing all of the week 4 content will help you construct the upcoming assignments. Additionally, I hope that you've noticed a difference in the presentation styles from the previous week. So before I used PowerPoint or Google Slides for the video lectures, but for this video lecture, I used Canva. Consider which platform you're going to use for your Project One multimodal presentation. Like me, you're required to narrate your presentation. Both Canva and PowerPoint allow you to like attach or create audio narration. They're free, easy platforms to use, but Canva sometimes has more, I think, creative templates and also features like dynamic or moving elements, like you see the little pencil moving about on the screen. They have a bunch of free little graphics like that. Your presentation is required to feature at least one moving element that has something to do with your presentation in some way. It can't just be like a little dancing man. But it can be a GIF, a moving graphic, or a short video clip related to your story. As for assignments, you have an optional worksheet again. This one's titled Sentence Structure, Topic Sentences. Why complete this assignment is worth 0 points. It's great practice for strengthening your topic sentences. Sure, you kind of know what you want your paragraphs to say, but when a main paragraph first begins, do you have a strong topic sentence ready to tell the reader why they're about to read that main section? This skill of drafting clear topic sentences for main body paragraphs is necessary for this course and for other courses. You, of course, have a quiz to complete, and quizzes are always due on Saturdays and cover a variety of questions. Then you have 3 discussions. This will be the pattern from here until the end of the course, 3 discussions instead of 2. But before you're like, 3 discussions is actually a good thing. For one, you have a less of a word count to hit for each discussion. Second, you don't have to reply for the first two discussions. You don't have to reply to peers. Second, you don't have to reply, or I'm sorry, I already said that, didn't I? Lastly, the third forum response is really about project one and peer review. So let's discuss each forum for greater understanding. The first discussion is about the characters of Mrs. North and Father Brown. First, watch the video about feminist literary criticism, then consider the power dynamics for each of those characters. Draft a 100-word post with this week's featured mode of literary criticism in mind with your answers. You must post the forum content by Saturday night. No peer responses are required, though they are encouraged. There's also an extra credit opportunity for the forums this week. Review part 4 of the forum post, which will lead to a Google form quiz about this class. Answer all the questions. It's anonymous. And again, it's optional. You don't have to do this. But if you do, email or text me the quiz password that pops up at the end. If you send me the correct password, I'll add points to one of your lowest scoring assignments. And there is a due date for the quiz just before that module week ends. I might also have it in module 5. You can only do the quiz once, but once that week passes, you can't get that extra credit opportunity. So the second discussion is about watching the module film, and then there were none. Discuss a theme or a story term that you compare with the film. Avoid merely regurgitating the plot like we all know it. You must post this 100-word content by Saturday night. Responses to peers are not required. In the second discussion, however, you are required to integrate a quote. To learn more about quote integration, visit the link in the discussion that features examples. The third discussion can only really begin once presenters for that week post their presentations. For example, return to the story list. Check which week you signed up for in that first column that says presenter first novel. If your name is there, this means you have to present about that story for this week, week 4, 5, 6, 7. Project one requires all of the elements that you see on screen. It's a multimodal presentation. You have to start with some appropriate visuals, text that doesn't overwhelm the reader. Maybe use bullet points. You don't have a lot of text on the screen because you're going to be narrating, right? So we don't need to see a lot of text on the screen. Feature a dynamic or a moving element like that texter that you see on the screen. Audio narration. And finally, a transcript of your entire narrated presentation is required. It doesn't have to be pretty or an essay format. It can be just bullet points or numbered items of what you actually said during your presentation, but that is also a required element. So your story analysis throughout your presentation should be neatly broken up into 3 distinct elements. The purpose of your presentation or your thesis should be clear, and it should be featured early on near the start of the presentation. And rather than you discussing random elements about the story, choose 2 story terms or themes as discussed in the module. You must also choose 1 form of literary criticism from the modules. Review the template on the screen to help you when you're constructing your presentation. You can also find this on the assignment page. So from the assignment page, you can also find the rubric I'll use while grading each presentation. It has point breakdowns. That's why this is valuable. While the rubric, it can look overwhelming, it's really just a set of yes or no questions I use to assess your final products. You can also review the rubric and use it as a checklist before you submit your project 1 presentation. So once you have everything recorded for your presentation and it's ready to go, upload the presentation link to YouTube or a similar website, then submit the link that you get for your assignment or submit the link that you get on a doc along with the transcript of everything you're going to say. So on the right side of the screen right now, that's what you should submit to me on the proper assignment portal in Brightspace. I should see your presentation link and it should be shareable and it should work so I can review it, your recorded presentation. And then I should also see on the same document your transcript, everything that you plan on that you did say during the presentation. After you've submitted the document to me so I can grade it, then return to the week 4C presentation forum and add the link there before Saturday night. They don't need your transcript, they just need your link. Your peers need it so they can respond to you by Tuesday night with substantive critique about your presentation, not just, I really like it. Maybe some kind of comment to help you strengthen your work, or maybe they compare and contrast it to one of their stories or another story term or a form of literary criticism. I don't want to know how much you liked their presentation. I want to know something substantive you thought about your peers' presentation. If you don't post your presentation to the forum on time, peers are not required to respond to you by Tuesday. More than one person may post for a particular week. If you're posting that week, you don't have to respond. If you're not posting that week, you must respond to at least 3 presentations or less, because we might not have 3. You'll miss out on these points if it was your week to present and you didn't submit to the forums on time or at all. Oh, there's a lot this week. So if you have any questions about the module or a specific question about an assignment, don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks for reviewing the video lecture. Have a great rest of your week.